How long has this been going on, and how deep and how significant are the issues that have led to this? Because it creates a momentum and a driving force in terms of the phenomenon. And if we're to address it or understand it, we need to understand the power that is behind it and the timeline behind it. The third is the situation, and we ask ourselves, what are the dynamics impacting this critical issue? In the case of Germany, you've got a church that is caring, receptive. The state church, Lutheran churches, and Catholic churches are wide open. They're involved in refugee work. They're committed to that. So in one sense, they have, it's part of who they are. It's part of their mission. Others maybe not have so much. In fact, just the opposite. They may be feeling threatened, and they feel like the refugees are going to take away their jobs. And so there's this backlash toward a kind of anti-migration and anti-refugee context that is going on across Europe, certainly in North America as well. So those are the questions. What is the situation, and what are the dynamics, and how do I identify those? And one of my observation is the more that you do that, the more that you think about it, the more other dynamics will come forward. So it's not a one-time pass. You continue to reflect on that. What's really going on here? How do I understand that? A good observer will be a person that participates. So you'll talk to people, walk with people, listen to people, tell their story, and then try to understand that story in the context of the bigger phenomenon that's taking place. The fourth of these context issues are the structures. What are the local structures that are going on, and how do those structures either facilitate, impede, or enhance this particular phenomenon and addressing it? So let's just look then next at some of the contextual factors. I identified these contextual factors because each has a major influence on any given context. The first is the social environment. What's going on in that social context, the society? What's going on? What are the presses? What are the polls? What are the questions? What are the fears? What's going on? What's the social establishment doing in handling this particular phenomenon, this particular situation? The second are the social structures. What social structures are in place politically, socially? Responses through various government organizations, nonprofit or non-governmental organization responses, churches. What's the social structure, and how does that bring available resources together? The religious beliefs, obviously, in this particular case this week, you've got Islam and Christianity. What's understood? Well, one of the fears is that if they return home after having converted or been baptized, that they'll be killed. Why? Because they're seen as an apostate. And there's a strong reaction against that in Islam. In Christianity, it's probably more likely to be a social sanction, although that can be very strong and lead to the kind of pressure that one can't deal with. So it doesn't really matter what religious context. There will be more extreme circumstances, perhaps, or interpretations, but there will be social pressure on, and there will be things that are happening framing that religious belief, either driving it toward evangelism and conversion, and baptism, which is what you're seeing in some of the Pentecostal groups, like the Little Flock movement and others. In terms of the church, the Lutheran church, that one pastor was talking about how excited he was to see about these kinds of conversions and baptisms. And so that becomes an important piece. The cultural values. What are the values, and how do people value various aspects? Loyalty, freedom, individual rights, human rights. These are kinds of questions that need to be interpreted for us to understand really what's going on here. And if it's amongst the church, and the church is reacting either positively or negatively, you ask yourself, what are the underlying values there? And are those values, do they square with the theology from that particular church or church group? And oftentimes they don't. In the case of the Little Flock, they believe baptize first and explain and learn later. Well, that certainly presents itself as what they're holding as valuable in that, and why so quickly they move to baptism, and how easily that could be corrupted in many ways, and a conversion that is a means to an end. So we begin to ask ourselves, institutional pressures, there are so many. Just think about the social welfare system. and the pressure to keep that from overwhelming, the demands from overwhelming the supply, the amount of money that they could do that. And so governments are asking themselves, can we really afford this? And if so, how do we afford it? And people are saying, are they going to take our jobs? And if they are, then that becomes a strong institutional value. If you're moving toward hiring labor at a lower wage than the particular society is used to, or the minimum wage, it throws the whole institutional response into imbalance and creates challenges and threats. One has to ask those kinds of questions. And then the other one that we don't always talk about are the spiritual forces. Is the Holy Spirit actively involved? Is God moving people toward God's self and bringing them into the kingdom? Or is it, are there evil forces that are taking place? For example, when we first started doing work with children at risk, one of the things that we saw was the demonic influence, just powerful, awful, corrupting, evil. And it's evil that is, you can sense it, maybe not always see it. You see the after effect of it, but you don't always see the depth of that demonic influence, but being perceptive to that and understanding. One of the things that we talk about is how that fits within culture, and so we'll look at that. We'll look at that next. So from the contextual forces, we go into what we might call the dimensions of culture. What is the worldview? We've talked a little bit about this before, but we look primarily at, when we think about the way people view the world, we think about how do they think about it in terms of ideas, if you will, cognition, cognitive reflection. How do they think? What thoughts do they have? What interpretations do they have? How do they talk about it with one another? And what is the conscious understanding of what's going on? There's another level, some have said a deeper level, and that is the aesthetic level, the affect. How do I feel about it? What is it? Am I feeling scared? Am I feeling excited? Am I feeling threatened? Am I feeling encouraged? Those feelings become important, and often those feelings are seen in aesthetic work such as art or music or drama or other forms of the arts that become a communication tool for the feelings and the attitudes that are going on. And it really is important to track that and ask yourself, how are people interpreting this, and how are they doing it in song, drama, and in art, various works of art, and how do we see that? Art therapy has become a very powerful tool in terms of caring for people when they've gone through trauma and they can articulate it, but they can draw it, and you can help them tell the story by their pictures and understanding that. So that becomes an important one. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the arts are one of the most critical windows in understanding a given context, and particularly as an outsider, to look and try to understand what is being communicated by that and what kind of an aesthetic is operative there. Then the last is what we would call normative, and the normative has a reflection of what are the social values, the norms that are held, the loyalties, the allegiances, the deep-seated feelings that are either positive or negative, pro or con. Those become important, and oftentimes you can get at that by seeing actions that people take. What are they doing and why? Ask them, why did you do that? How do you feel about that? Now, obviously, you've got to be gentle and understanding and sensitive in that question process. But that is the way to get at this understanding. What's going on here? How do I understand the dimensions of culture? And how is culture interpreting this given phenomenon within a given context? Just a couple more briefly. The first is the concept of worldview. I've used the word contemporary worldview. They used to use the word modern, but in contemporary, there's the kind of separation between the spiritual or the religious and the natural or the scientific, the science and religion, or faith and the work that's going on. So the question becomes, how do we understand that? And emerging out of that in the work by Paul Hebert initially and by others has come what they call the excluded middle, the middle zone. That is the explanations for the here and now, and how we understand, for example, how God intervenes, or how people understand the spirit world and where that comes from. one of the important things for highlighting that is just to remind you that that's a very fruitful area of thought. The book by Hebert, Shaw, and Tienu on folk religion becomes an important one. Also, the article on the flaw of the excluded middle, which I took this from, it's recorded in Hebert's work that was published in 2008. I've got the note there on the bottom of that slide that you could check out. Another one is the concept of the typology of sets and the concept of how do we understand whether something is bounded or centered. There's a lot of fruitful conversation around that, and I've got the reference there for you to check. But we often talk primarily about bounded sets and centered sets. A bounded set, the focus is on the boundary. Are you in or are you out? And one of the things that baptism presents in the context of this case study is kind of an initiation. Once you're baptized, you're in. You're an insider. You were out, but now you're in. And the mark is that particular ritual, the ritual of baptism. But the critical question is not so much are you in or out, but how do you relate to Christ? And if in your life, are you following Christ? Are you surrendering yourself in a sense to the Messiah, to the one who came to save and to give us life? And so the question then is, how do you relate to Jesus? What is your relation? And that's where the centered set comes in. It's not so important whether you're in or out. That there is a question there, and that is important, but it's not the central focus. The central focus is Christ. And how do you relate to Christ? Are you moving toward Christ or away from Christ? And so the concept of a centered set puts Christ at the center rather than membership in a church, membership in a particular religious tradition. It's how do you relate to Jesus and how do we understand that? And we continue to put that forward, and it's become a very fruitful conversation. I commend that article to you. It's referenced there. And your reading, if you haven't read it already. If you have, there's a lot to describe and use and apply in the approach to context. The last of these models was taken from Chuck Kraft's work, and Dr. Kraft was looking at this worldview concept, the worldview of cognitive, affective, and normative, or allegiances. And so what he did is he asked what kind of an encounter takes place in terms of our mission in the world between each of those three, if you will, major categories of worldview or understanding and the particular Christian witness. And obviously at the cognitive or the explicit behavior, it's truth encounter. You're focusing on understanding what's the truth, how do I know the truth? How do I interpret that? So it's the application, the verbal testimony, if you will, the testimony from Scripture. How do we have this truth confrontation? And the truth about baptism becomes one of the critical factors in assessing that and in that encounter. The second is the area of affect or emotion, and Kraft talks about power encounter, and he's written extensively on this. If you haven't read anything by Kraft on that, it's well worth the time it takes to read one of the books or think about that. Jay Travis is teaching it now. He too has done a lot of work in this area and worth your reading. But it's the concept on being free from oppression and free from evil and the forces of darkness and free to live in the light. And the concept of a power encounter is a freeing experience. And again, art and symbol and these kinds of things help interpret how that is experienced often. And so you can look at it accordingly. The third is the concept of an allegiance encounter, and that is at the heart of the question of baptism for these converts, because if they return home, they can be killed. And so the question is, where's your allegiance? Is your allegiance still to Islam and to your Muslim culture, or is it to Christ and to your Christian affiliations? And that becomes a very important question, and one that is not easily dealt with. And often it's not just one decision or one opportunity, but a series of them. And we've seen testimonies of this. We've heard, read, and interacted with people who have gone through these experiences. So the allegiance then becomes the critical factor in these conversions at the point of how do you stand up for what you believe in this new experience. Well, there's the second thing about context. many of these things you know, and I encourage you to draw more widely on what you've learned and what you know thus far. So I hope that you find help in that, and we look forward to your reflections.